The Clone Wars. So this is part of what I've been calling my television addiction series, in which I go back and talk about all the TV shows I watched in 2011 and 2012 when I was living in Cambodia and was watching way too many DVDs. For more information on what exactly this series is and why I'm doing it, I'll link to a video in the description down below. But for today, I'm going to talk about the Clone Wars. Now, I suspect I have this in common with a lot of people in that when this show first came out in 2008, I thought this was the stupidest thing ever. I didn't actually see any episodes of it. I was living in Japan at the time. I didn't have access to the Cartoon Network where I believe it was playing. But I heard about other people's reviews of it, and I had my own preconceptions, perhaps. It's worth remembering that at the time this came out, appreciation for George Lucas's prequel trilogy was perhaps at an all-time low. The Revenge of the Sith had just come out in 2005. I did the same thing everybody did, where for all three of the prequel movies, I got super excited right before they came out, and then I saw them and I was kind of a little bit meh, and then after seeing them a few more times, I kind of grew to hate them, grew to see all their flaws. And it was right about that time that the Clone Wars theatrical release came out. Now, this really seemed like it had everything going against it. It was what appeared to be a very cheaply animated cartoon movie. And it was a prequel set within the prequels. So it was between episodes 2 and 3 of the prequel trilogy. And at this point, I was completely over prequels. I'm still not wild about them, to be honest. I much prefer stories that move the plot forward rather than this whole prequel thing. That's somewhat maybe of a different topic for a different video. How much I don't like it when Star Wars or Star Trek keeps doing prequels. I think prequels are boring. Move the timeline forward. But anyways, it was a prequel. It was set between episodes 2 and 3, and I never actually saw the movie that got a theatrical release, although I spend a lot of time on YouTube watching other people's reviews of movies, so I feel like I'm basically familiar with the premise and all its faults. This was the movie, the theatrical release of the Clone Wars, was where Anakin Skywalker gets a young apprentice of his own to mentor. And this just seemed to me to be all kinds of stupid. I mean, for one, we already know that Anakin Skywalker doesn't turn out well in the end. So what's the point of giving him somebody to mentor and showing how this was going to grow him as a person? Sorry, I guess I'm referring here to interviews I saw with George Lucas, where he talks about his idea for how Anakin Skywalker having a Padawan or having somebody to mentor was going to help him mature or develop that caring side of himself. But the other thing is, it's set right between episodes 2 and 3, and we know that this character, Ahsoka Tano, I believe is her name, doesn't show up at all in episode 3. So it's like, okay, right backwards to the problem of prequels, where we're creating continuity problems by introducing all these new characters. But plus, we already had a Clone Wars TV show. I guess everyone forgets about this nowadays, but that was back in 2003 and 2005, between episodes 2 and 3, where in order to keep the hype going or to advance the storyline, there was this whole series of cartoon shows which were showing what was happening in the Clone Wars in between episodes 2 and 3. I actually never saw any of those episodes. I was never a big fan of the 2003 to 2005 cartoon Clone Wars, although I have friends who did watch it, and I have friends who were fans. But just as a matter of principle, as somebody who's a geek, and as somebody who over my life has devoted a fair amount of my attention to geek franchises, I don't like this kind of thing on principle, where you have fans who watched the 2003 to 2005 cartoon series because they were told it was canon, and got invested in it. And then all of a sudden, a few years later, it's like, okay, forget that cartoon series you saw earlier. We're starting something new. Although, again, back in 2008, it wasn't clear, or at least it wasn't clear to me. Maybe I was reading the wrong articles. It wasn't clear that this new Clone Wars TV show was replacing the old one. Wasn't. Is it just me, or was it generally not clear to everyone? I thought it was maybe existing a long time alongside of it as both being canon. But then it's like, well, how do they both fit in? It seemed that, plus all the terrible reviews that the 2008 theatrical Clone Wars got. And that plus, it was more about Anakin Skywalker, and at this point, everyone was just so over Anakin Skywalker and the horrible character that he was in the prequel trilogy. So I completely wrote off Clone Wars. I thought this was more of a last gasp of dying George Lucas empire trying to milk every dying penny out of a franchise that they just beaten to death. So it surprised me a couple years later when people actually started really liking the Clone Wars. Now, if memory serves, the first time I heard any positive appraisal of this was from a friend of mine who does a blog by the name of Whiskey Prager. And I'll link to his article, his blog post in the description down below. But in 2010, he described his experience watching the Clone Wars with his daughters. He's a man of similar temperaments to me, but he had two daughters, 9 and 11, back in 2010 at least, who did not like his entertainment choices. So he was talking about what a struggle it is to find something the whole family enjoys watching. And he talks about how they ended up renting the Clone Wars and starting right with Season 1, Episode 1 and watching it and sort of rolling their eyes at it at first and recognizing all the tired tropes that were in it. But then within 2 or 3 episodes of it, actually starting to have a lot of fun with it. And I believe he describes it as it was rediscovering the original fun of those old movie serials that the original Star Wars movies were inspired by. And he attributes this to the fact that George Lucas was pretty hands-off with the Clone Wars TV series. And again, this was not something that was immediately apparent back when it was first being released and the press releases were first coming out for it in 2008. But apparently this was true. You had all sorts of people writing and directing it who were not George Lucas. And as a result, were producing some very entertaining stories. So he encouraged me to watch it, and a few years later, when I was in Cambodia, 2011 and 2012, in the land of cheap DVDs, I bought a DVD set of it and watched a few episodes and enjoyed it, more or less. So yeah, let me talk about my experience. I did not actually start with Season 1, for reasons I don't quite recall, but it was probably the same reason as always. Season 1 must not have been available in the stores I went to at that time. I was looking at Wikipedia trying to figure out which season I started with. I remember the first few episodes of that season was focused on Admiral Akbar. Only he wasn't Admiral Akbar at the time. He was, what was he, Captain Akbar or Lieutenant Akbar or just Akbar. and he was leading his troops in some sort of underwater battle, if I remember. And looking at Wikipedia, this looks like it was the start of season 4. But I also have memories in my head during my time in Cambodia of watching some episodes where these clone troopers are getting some sort of premonition of Order 66. Order 66 is this order from the Revenge of the Sith, where all of a sudden the clone troopers, like a switch goes off, and they get Order 66 and they just kill all the Jedi around them. Which is a little bit strange narratively, but the Clone Wars did this whole series of episodes on it, trying to make a mystery out of it, or trying to explore what it must have been like for these clone troopers having this pre-programmed into them. And according to Wikipedia, I think those Order 66 episodes came from season 6, which didn't come out until 2014. So I must have picked up some seasons of Clone Wars a little bit later, after 2012, because I continued living in Cambodia until 2015. So I've got in my head half-remembered, jumbled episodes of Clone Wars, and I can't talk about it in any specific detail, but I can talk about it in general terms. It does indeed capture the fun of the old movie serials, and this is true very much in the stylistic choices they make. It's true in the voiceover narration at the beginning of every episode. And it's a great throwback, and it just sets the tone for what you're about to enjoy. And the individual episodes, or the individual story arcs, can be quite enjoyable. If you're not familiar with the show, I suspect most people are familiar with it, but if you're not familiar with it, the story arcs are in different segments. Sometimes a story arc will just be one episode. Sometimes a story arc will cover 3 episodes. Sometimes a story arc will cover 6 episodes. But then once that story arc is done, then the show just moves on to a new story arc completely. And there are quite often callbacks to previous story arcs, but it's not like when you're watching a season, you're watching one continuous story. Each season is a collection of different stories, some of which span multiple episodes. I've heard it called an anthology show, and that seems to be fairly accurate description. And apparently, I didn't realize this when I was actually watching the show, but learned this later on YouTube. Apparently, it's not even in order. So, there are different seasons, but the stories are not in chronological order. There is on the internet somewhere a list of all the episodes and what order they are chronological, so you could rearrange them chronologically if if that's how you wanted to watch it. The other thing that surprised me a bit is I was expecting all of these episodes to be about Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, kind of similar to the theatrical release. But it wasn't at all. Each episode is about its own thing, and they explore some of the minor characters in the Star Wars universe. Jar Jar Binks gets an episode, some episodes devoted to him. Samuel L. Jackson's character, Mace Windu, will get an episode. Be an episode with R2-D2 and C-3PO. But there will also be a lot of episodes about the clones, or the stormtroopers, or whatever you want to call them, the clone soldiers. And throughout the course of the series, you get introduced to characters who are clones who get developed throughout the series. And this is perhaps where I think I was disadvantaged jumping just into season 4 starting out, because there'd be episodes about these clones and I'd be like, who are these guys? I don't care about them. They're just clones. And the clones in the Star Wars universe, up until that TV series at least, had always been disposable characters. You know, they were there, they were faceless stormtroopers with the helmets. Their whole reason for existing was so that you could have all these antagonists that you didn't care about, that were very easy to just kill off and not feel any humanity for them. And now we're having episodes devoted to them, and, you know, even within the whole Star Wars universe, you know that they're all clones of one guy. You know that they're all pre-programmed. You know that they have this kill switch lurking in their head that's going to turn them into a mindless zombie one day. It just... I couldn't understand why I should care about them or why I was watching it. And I think these are characters that had been introduced in earlier seasons, even though the Clone Wars TV series is supposedly all out of order. That doesn't mean that later seasons don't call back to things that were established in earlier seasons. I think the later seasons assume familiarity with the earlier seasons. It wasn't an impediment in terms of understanding the story, but it was an impediment in terms of not really caring about who these clone troopers were. And I would watch several story arcs with the clone troopers, kind of being like, not really sure why I'm watching that or why I care about them. And then it would go back to an episode about Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, and I'd be like, familiar faces. Okay, back to the characters I know, which is ironic because, you know, as I just said, I really hated the prequel Anakin Skywalker, but just seeing a familiar face again while watching the Clone Wars made me feel more comfortable with it. Since seeing Rebels, some of Star Wars Rebels, I've seen some of these clone troopers from the Clone Wars pop up later in Rebels. So they have been carried on into later series and are continuing to be developed. I have, to this day, never actually sat down and watched the whole Clone Troopers saga. Sorry, what am I saying? The whole Clone Wars saga, meaning I've never watched the whole Clone Wars TV show. So I'm sure I'm missing out on a lot of great story arcs, and I'm sure perhaps sitting down and watching it from beginning to end would increase my appreciation of it. Although it seems like even the most ardent fans of the show do agree that not every episode is great. Apparently there are some boring episodes mixed in there, but it's an anthology show, so it doesn't bother people so much. You can skip over the boring episodes easily. I enjoyed what I saw of Star Wars Clone Wars, but I didn't feel at the time any need to stick with it. And this again was just because it was a midquel to the prequels. It was something set between episodes 2 and 3. I already knew what was going to happen to Anakin Skywalker. I already knew what was going to happen to Obi-Wan Kenobi. I did not care about the clone troopers. Having enjoyed a few episodes, I didn't feel any need to stick with it to find out how the story was going to end. I think I used the Clone Wars more or less just as a way to kill time. It was an enjoyable 22 minutes if you would put on a DVD of it after you got home from work or, before going to bed. But it was nothing, it was certainly nothing like Game of Thrones where you felt like you had to stay with it to figure out where the story is going. It was completely disposable, maybe, or you could completely... Yeah, maybe disposable. You didn't feel any. I didn't feel any obligation to watch the whole series, and I didn't. I guess I must have watched parts of season 4, and a little while later, I guess I must have picked up season 6 and watched parts of that. And it was perfectly enjoyable for what it was, but never felt any need to watch the whole thing. So that's my recommendation, sort of, for Clone Wars.